Thanks very much, Lindsay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. My name is Don Jones, and I am joined by Greg Shields. We're author evangelists for Pluralsight, and one of the reasons we wanted to talk to you today about frequent OS upgrades being a new competence in the world of IT is partially because of the experience we had talking to different customers. For example, a large part of what Greg and I do is split around two basic things. We, on one hand, spend a lot of time talking to different customers in different locations, and on the other hand, spend a lot of time trying to teach folks how to do the latest and greatest things in IT. And I guess what really I want to kick this off with is, why are you still running Windows Server 2003? This is an operating system that's going to be end of life in less than a year now. It's September 2014 as we're speaking. So less than a year this is going to be end of life. Why are you still running it? And it's a little bit of a facetious question. We know there's reasons. And Greg, what are some of the top things people tend to tell you when you ask them that question?
It is sort of humorous that we're still talking about Windows Server. What is that now? 11 years past its release date.
Yeah,
I have
a little bit.
I think changed vehicles. I think a time or two since then, but some people are still on that same operating system. Honestly, a lot of the reasons, at least that I've been told, that people are still keeping on these operating systems has a lot to do with just the applications that sit on top. There is a reticence to move away from those applications. There's a reticence to perhaps really kind of stick it to the vendors to tell them, hey, look, it's time to make a change of your own so that we can make a change of our own.
Yeah, and it is funny because you and I spend a lot of time out at conferences and in classrooms and in boardrooms talking to people, and I feel like every time I'm getting ready to do one of those engagements, I have to make sure I'm absolutely up on all the latest. I have to know the little details about dynamic access control and desired state configuration, and then we walk in and everyone's like, whoa, 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 slow down, that's 2012 R2. NT4 was good enough for my grandfather, and it's good enough for me. We're not going anywhere. And so it is kind of funny, but you're right. I think I tried to categorize it into three basic areas, and the first is exactly what you said. It's software compatibility. And that's not something that you can just stand up and boldly pronounce that you're going to not care about, because if you've got mission-critical applications and they're running on a server, you kind of have to stay with that server. You can't really move forward necessarily, although I think we've both run into times when people have said, look, I can't move forward because of compatibility. And we've, in some cases, been able to sit down and drill to the bottom of that statement. And sometimes you can move forward. So it's worth talking about that a little bit. But that's not the only one. There's these other issues as well, right?
It's funny you should mention that notion of compatibility being sometimes a false reason why people are going, an unknown false reason why, because in many situations where we've sat down with people in different sized organizations, the software compatibility excuse really turns out to be a lack of time and resources reason. And a lot of it has to do with just, I think, a core misunderstanding about what compatibility actually entails, and also a core misunderstanding about what could go into shimming applications into compatibility or sending them into locations where their incompatibilities can be minimized, sandboxing them, for example. And when people these days, just like everyone is, are running around just trying to keep everything up and running, which is exactly what they're doing, that lack of time and resources in some ways inhibits the development of that core knowledge that would help them get off of those old platforms.
Yeah, and doing so is a big risk. I mean, at the end of the day, we are running around and fixing stuff, but if what we have today basically works, what's the phrase? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So moving anything in any direction other than stay still creates a real risk. I mean, I don't want to be the one who gets the phone call at 1 a.m. that the director of sales can't get into his line of business application or whatever. He can get into it today, and I want him to be able to get into it tomorrow, and that means just let's not change things, because there's a lot of risk involved in change. I mean, we have entire processes and management techniques that are around managing change and slowing change to a rate that is reasonable. So these are all absolutely 100% legitimate concerns. No one will ever stand up and say, well, you have to upgrade anyway. Heck with compatibility. No one will ever say, you have to upgrade no matter how much time it takes. No one's ever going to say, well, to nonsense with the risk, you have to upgrade anyway. These are all real reasons. But something has changed a little bit in the past couple of years, and frequent OS upgrades, frequent OS releases are the new reality. This is just what's going to happen now. Server 2012 came out toward the end of 2012, right, Greg?
More or less.
Yeah, and we're getting ready to hear an announcement about whatever's next, roughly a year later. And Microsoft has said, we're doing this every year. And they're not the only ones. I mean, Linux operating systems have often been on much faster track for different releases. So in some ways, it's like Microsoft is just starting to kind of catch up with where the rest of the world is and pumping out new versions of operating systems a lot more frequently. And they actually have a word for it.
You bring up an excellent point about this whole notion of this being the new reality. It isn't the new reality for many of the other operating systems, many other experiences that are out there in the world. The notion of, and you can flip the slide, the notion of a faster cadence, a cloud-oriented cadence, is something that is exactly has been done already many times in the past with your other operating systems. We're seeing in many of the other OSs that are already in environments. The idea of having a more rapidly, many changes happening, but smaller incremental changes happening is something that we're seeing in other places. And so Microsoft is almost kind of trailing in comparison with many of the other companies that are out there. This slide is pretty cool. Mary Jo Foley, awesome person, great writer also, spoke recently that said that the powers that be are encouraging the Windows development team to see how much they can get done within a much shorter time frame and then plan to deliver whatever is baked in the next few months. This seems really scary for us as Windows admins, but this is not anything new when you look at it in the greater scheme of all the different devices and things that are currently out in the world. Am I right, Tom?
Yeah, it is a little crazy because I think what we're used to in the Windows world is about every 3 to 5 years we get something it's basically done. I mean, yeah, there's bugs and there'll be hot fixes, and that's always going to be the case, but it's got a well thought out set of features. Now, maybe our companies don't care about those features, and that's fine, but we're getting a story. And that's not the case anymore. We're not getting a story, we're getting chapters. It's almost like as fast as Microsoft can get something to compile and get through test reliably, they're going to ship it to us. And that's not completely wrong. I think the real lesson here comes from the word that Microsoft is using, or the phrase, cloud cadence. They're developing these technologies for their purposes. They're developing in large part for Azure first, and then periodically they'll wrap up all that stuff and give it to us in a way we can consume. And that means they're actually iterating a lot quicker than we're even seeing. I mean, we might be getting operating system releases once every year. They're getting them every couple of months, once a quarter, but much smaller. And I think maybe that's an important place to start, because this is maybe a terminology change. We've never had a huge problem in our industry rolling out service packs in a basically timely fashion. I'm not saying that everybody rolls out service packs the day they come out, but most organizations I work with, within 3 to 6 months of a service pack being released, because you wait a little while to see if it's going to explode into a million pieces, they get it installed and they get it basically rolled out. And I think what's important is in the Microsoft world, service packs have always introduced minor new functionality, minor changes to functionality, sometimes major. I don't know if anybody remembers Exchange 2010 Service Pack 2, where they turned off all the multi-tenant capabilities. That was a major change. And we also get bug fixes. And I think that's kind of what the new operating systems look like now, isn't it?
Do you remember, this was a number of years ago, when you and I were sitting down talking about, it might have been the Vista to 7 change or the 7 to 8 change, and we were waxing philosophic about just the names themselves that Microsoft applies to its different operating systems have this sort of, they create this sense of an elevated barrier to get from one step to the other. And how at that time, and this was many years ago before we started to get to where we are today, how we were thinking about the idea if Microsoft were to refer to Windows 8 as Windows 7.1, how much easier it would be for people to just simply get something like this rolled out because of this irrational sense of a whole number integer change being a really big thing, whereas in reality, we're talking about, as you see here, what is mainly a service pack update in many of these cases. So absolutely, just simply changing the way in which these things are advertised and delivered automatically provides us with a kind of a better sense that maybe this is just something that's very safe for us to do.
That's a really good point. That's one I hadn't thought about until you just said it, is when it was that major, when it was XP, and then it was Vista, and then it was 7, and then it was 8, it feels like a big enough change, and Microsoft certainly markets it as momentous, in part because they want all the consumers out there to rush out and buy a new copy of Windows. The business market, they do treat a little differently. A lot of organizations have software assurance. You've already paid for your upgrade. It's a tiny bit less of a money thing. But because all the advertising we see and all the marketing we see is so, this is a huge deal, you must rush out and purchase the new system immediately, we in our heads start to triage it. We start looking at it and going, well, what new features does this offer? If it's a big deal, then there's something really important to my company, then maybe I'll think about it, and our company will roll it out. And it's funny because it's like the only operating system we treat that way. Apple rolls out a dot release to iOS, or Google rolls out a dot release to Android. Everybody has it downloaded off the internet within a week, and we don't even think about it because they're minor changes, and it is a perception thing. But I mean, even if it's not a perception thing, even if it's not solely a terminology thing, I think it's worth asking the question, what if you just say no? Windows 2003, Windows 2008 R2, it's serving us well, it's done fine, I'm just going to not upgrade. And that was a thing for a while because, I mean, between 2000 and now, or 2003 and now, we really didn't have that many releases of the operating system. I don't think we're going to be able to hold off on that pattern much longer. In the same amount of time, if they release every year, we're going to be 11 versions on from the operating system. If you wait that same 11 years to upgrade from what you have now to whatever you have out then is going to be 11 versions on, isn't it?
Yeah, it's worth mentioning too that if you had mentioned the fact that Apple releases these updates that are point releases and Android releases updates that are point releases. When Android releases an update, it arrives on my phone. There are certain ways, I believe, where you can even just get the upgrade without even, you wake up the next morning and poof, you're on the next Android. And I think just socially, we've socialized the notion that a new OS, with all capital letters there, a new OS is a mind-numbingly challenging solution. But there appears to be a bit of a sea change in just the way that those are being delivered. And when a new OS is more or less the same OS that you had before, and it just arrives, there's still obviously some opportunity for you to determine when you accept it, but it makes me think that when we diminish the focus on how huge that operating system is, it makes me wonder if people may or may not necessarily fall farther behind. I don't know. There are risks to falling behind. Do you think there's a way in which we can just sort of completely change the mindset of the industry?
I don't know. I think it does become a matter of the risks of falling behind. I mean, it's easy enough to say, the first iPhone came out in 2006, and now we're 8 versions of their operating system along. And we've got many fewer versions of Windows Server that we've been through in that period of time. But in theory, Microsoft tells us we're going to get a release a year. I don't know. It's easy enough to point to a consumer device and say, well, it's easier for consumers to keep up. My iPhone doesn't run my entire company, which is totally true. I'm definitely a lot more sensitive about my server's stability. And I honestly think maybe that's where it comes from. Is your server safer? Is it more stable? Is your life easier when you are 6, 7, 8, 9 versions behind the leading edge? And I think that's where you have to talk about it. What if we just don't upgrade? What if we just sit where we are? What we have works right now. It's fine. It's stable. I understand it. What if we just leave it alone? And I think there are some risks. I think one risk is almost the minute you buy into this concept of, okay, cloud Cadence, we're going to get a new version every year, but I'll skip every 2 or 3 versions. Microsoft is shipping software every year or so. It's whatever's baked when they get around to the ship date. That's what they put together and bake. This is agile development. By definition, they know they're going to be shipping bugs. You can test as much as you want to. We all know the minute you ship software to an actual human being, they're going to find a bug right away. The point is, when you're developing software that quickly, you're definitely shipping bugs. So let's say you upgrade, you roll out some Server 2012 R2. You skip the next 3 versions. There were definitely stability bugs, security bugs, weaknesses in the version you installed that were probably fixed in the next one or the next one and the next one, and you just decided to skip those. I think that's a huge, huge operational risk, particularly as we see all of these instances of companies just getting hacked who basically don't have, I mean, it's not like the cash registers at Target were internet facing. It doesn't take much of a vulnerability for someone to take advantage of it, and if they've got a 3-year or 5-year, 6-year window in which to hack on a bug, they're going to get something out of you. So I think that's one big risk.
Well, and your second bullet here in the upper right talks about cross-compatibility and just the sheer number of operating systems that we're going to have. You know, you talk about Apple and its point releases out there. If we're having more versions of Windows and you just put your foot in the ground and say, no, we're not going to upgrade, all of a sudden you can see yourself with having not just, say, Vista and 7 or Vista and 7 and 8. You start finding yourself having 3 or 4 or 6 or 8 or more quote-unquote versions of the operating system that now you have to sort of regress against. And that almost ends up becoming a risk all by itself, I would think.
Yeah, it does. You know, you almost run into the reverse version of the problem we started talking about. A lot of people don't upgrade their servers because they've got applications running on them, and those applications are only compatible with that version of Windows, and that's fine. But now your company goes to buy some new version, some new application rather, something that's going to make the business better. It's probably going to be made for one of the more recent versions of Windows. And so you're going to be forced to have all these different versions unless you have some means of just keeping them all or most of them rolling along to the latest. I think most of us would agree that in a perfect world, we only run one version of something. And I think the only way that we're going to be able to sustain that or even come close is by continuing to roll along. And speaking of rolling along, this is my next point. I talk to people all the time, and you know, we get to go to conferences and we talk about cool stuff, and I'm a big PowerShell guy, and desired state configuration is out, and it's awesome, and OneGet is coming out, and it's cool. And I go to conferences and I talk to folks, and they're like, yeah, this is really great. I'm never going to get to touch it, though, because my organization, we're 3 versions behind. I'm like, that's the saddest thing in the world. You've got this entire team of IT people who got into it because they love what they do. They love to play with the new stuff. And they can't do any of it because the entire business is running on 11-year-old software. And that means when that new application or that new need or that new feature finally does come around, they're going to be so far behind, you're not going to be able to take advantage of it. I mean, as a business, your skill sets are just as old as your operating systems. And falling behind on the skill set, that's a real tragedy. It makes it tougher to keep people. I would not work for a company if I had any options, if it meant working with just old stuff all day long. I want to play with some of the new stuff too, right?
Yeah, you know, I can't get over the fact that in a lot of these organizations, people perceive the pain of actually keeping up with the versions. I wonder how many people were so burned by the massive changes that occurred in that switch between XP and Vista, that switch between whatever happened before 03 and 03, so 2000 and 2003, the Bill Gates memo where they essentially went through and rewrote Windows, made it more secure. Because every operating system since then has really, I mean, between you and us and the 4 walls, has really been kind of a point release over the top of that when you look at the actual core areas where incompatibilities happen. And I wonder sometimes if this disinterest in upgrading, this interest in staying put where we're at, is based off of just feeling a little burned by that experience many, many years ago. You know, I mean, you and I can say this, the differences between Windows 7 and Windows 8, it looks a little different, but actually under the covers, maybe not so much, especially in comparison. So I always wonder sometimes if there's a little bit of just people feel burned by what had happened and are going to just stick that way for the rest of time.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy too. You know, if you skip 4 versions, now the accretion of minor updates has become a major hurdle. Now it actually is going to be a big problem to roll out the new operating system because you're making such a big leap. You know, if you were to to take somebody who was running the very first version of Android and then suddenly put a phone in their hand that was running the very latest version. They wouldn't know where anything was or how to operate their phone anymore. They'd have to start all over. And that's a real operational risk of not kind of keeping the minor versions rolling along. But I kind of want to, not with legitimate reasons not to roll up your operating systems all the time, but there's also some legitimate risks behind not doing so. I kind of want to, we're not here to make sure you buy the Windows. We don't sell copies of Windows. What we're here to really talk about is how to line up your team so that you can do what's right for your business, whether that's staying put, or I think what's probably right for your business is something closer to keeping reasonably up to date as much as you can. And that's what we really came here to talk about today, because the reality is you are going to have many, many newer versions of Windows Server much, much more often. And being able to keep up is now part of the job. And that means you've got to be able to stand up and look your boss in the eye and say, we can rapidly evaluate new versions of Windows for compatibility, for stability, whatever else. We have those skills. We can upgrade and we can migrate on a rolling schedule. It doesn't have to be one of these project-based things where we shut down the entire data center and camp out for the weekend and upgrade everything. And we can minimize the risk. And I think having those competencies, and being able to say these statements and being able to make them truthful is really, really important. And Greg, you had some good thoughts on this, kind of being I guess around the project-basedness. We think about doing an OS upgrade, and it's a project.
There's a quote I guess I've been quoted lately with saying, and that is that being the system-centered person is a great way to never lose your job. And it works hand in hand even with the PowerShell stuff that you've worked with yourself, because I am flummoxed by the fact that I can continue to go to these conferences and still be able to stand up and teach presentations on how to automatically deploy applications using tools like System Center or nowadays like PowerShell. And so there are some competencies in rapid deployment of operating systems and in applications that are surprisingly still not found in a lot of IT organizations. So, we can talk about the use of virtualization as a mechanism to help you evaluate, mitigate, upgrade, and just move forward. But the things that wrap around virtualization, all those automations, there is absolutely a need for those kinds of skills in every single environment. And if you don't see them in your environment, that's the perfect way to become almost indispensable for the team that you are working on, is becoming the automation person.
Yeah, I have a snarky thing I say when I talk to folks sometime, and it's next time you go back to work, look at the person next to you and the person on the other side of you and ask yourself, how am I going to make sure that if push comes to shove, they get laid off and not me? And it's a little ruthless, but at the end of the day, you've got to feed your family and pay the mortgage, and the way you do that is making sure you're indispensable. And if you can have a truthful answer to these questions, then that is an operational competency that organizations will not be able to live without. And I think there's probably three things that, broadly speaking, most folks are probably missing if they can't deliver those three things. And I guess the first one's training, right?
Oh, absolutely. I got to tell you, thinking of that comment of you standing in front of these poor IT pros and telling them to look at their fellow people around them, their fellow coworkers, and be that person that's not getting fired. I have this vision of like the Mad Max Thunderdome with all the IT pros in it firing PowerShell commands at each other. And
I always think of it as the Lord of the Flies method of managing IT.
You're absolutely right in that training has to be a part of the mix. And in a world, in an industry particularly that is constantly on the move, having training, and training in the right format, training in the format that actually, keeps up with the technology, can be where you are. That kind of training is something that is digestible to a person, considering how fast-paced the world is these days. Is something it just has to happen because the technology is constantly on the move.
Yeah, and there's a lot of options out there, and different people have different things. I myself, sometimes for some topics, I'm a reader. Sometimes I like to browse through people's blog posts and just kind of get a context for what's happening. I'm not the type of person to go sit in a 5-day class. I would more likely, if I need a 20-minute overview, and then I'll jump around and dig into the bits that are meaningful to me right then, and I'll come back for more later if I want to. I'm not so much to just blast it all at me for 5 days and hope that some of it sticks. And I think a lot of organizations have gotten really bitten by expensive training, inefficient training, having people be out of the office for weeks at a time training. And so some organizations, not all organizations, training is kind of a bad word. And I think there's a way to change that. I think you just need to think about real value-added training. What's something that you can consume quickly that you can immediately put to use? And that's a phrase you and I have used for a long time, immediately effective. And it's part of the culture of the organization has to understand that training doesn't necessarily mean I have to go to 20 days of training and come back with nothing to show for it. And I think a lot of that gets back to what you just said too. I think the way to focus your training on something that's going to be more immediately effective and meaningful is to focus on automation. Do not take any training that is just going to show you how to go next, finish through a wizard. You need to be focused on how can I build units of automation, and I don't care if it's PowerShell or Python or System Center Orchestrator or whatever tool you've got. How can you build units of automation so that instead of you pushing buttons, you're making the buttons that other people can push? My favorite story is back when I was at Bell Atlantic. I'm not a people person, Greg. I don't know if that comes as a surprise to you or not. Not a people person, and anytime anyone called me on the phone to ask me something, my sole goal was to make sure that that never happened again. And if you asked me to do anything in IT, I wouldn't do it. I would write a script that did it. And that way, the next time, you could call the help desk, and they had the script, and they could take care of the problem for you, and you didn't have to call me. And today it's inbox 0. That's the goal. No messages in your inbox. For me, it was voicemail 0. If nobody called me, it was a good day. And I think that kind of, building that as part of just your lifestyle, your routine, and focusing on automation that way, point your training in that direction. Focus on the things that are going to let you do things without actually doing them yourself.
The advice I give to people also is somewhat similar to that, but it's essentially make the conscious decision in your career to choose not to do anything manually. Every single time you get a request to accomplish some sort of task, force yourself to spend the extra minutes or even hours in some cases that it requires to build an automation out of that. And it will take a while, and you will actually be not efficient for a reasonable period of time while you're going through that. But the result of which is that as you continue to build that quiver of automations, you begin to find yourself with a nice little catalog of possible ways that you can reconnect these things together to accomplish things when you get the next opportunity to make a change or to do something. So, making that conscious decision to never do things manually is one of the best things you can do if you're willing to make the investment.
And I think the other thing too, building that kind of automation to deal with the day-to-day lets you free up some time from the day-to-day firefighting so you can focus on moving things ahead. Because it goes right back to what we said earlier, time and resources is one of the reasons we don't move our environments along in versions as quickly as we might otherwise. We just don't have the time to figure it out or to physically do the work. Well, if you can automate your way through some of the day-to-day nonsense and push that off to less experienced people by writing units of automation, then progress, moving forward, can become your routine instead of the daily grind of fighting fires. And I don't know very many people in IT who would not prefer to have a routine of progress. I'm going to come in and I'm going to work on moving things forward every single day because it's a lot more fun than just resetting someone's password again for the 19th time this week. So we've got some specifics that we want to talk about around these things. And the first one, and I guess we can both talk about this a little bit, is dealing with the issue of software compatibility. I think, first of all, one of the things that we've not typically been very good at in any IT, and this goes all the way back to my days as an AS400 operator, is that when we buy a piece of software, we buy this and we understand what the prereqs are, but we never really press the vendor to tell us what happens when we want to upgrade. Okay, so I'm buying this today and it's going to take SQL Server 2012 and it's going to run on Windows Server 2012, and that's great. But hey vendor, Microsoft ships a new version of this stuff every year now. What's the plan? How do you deal with that? Oh, well, you have to pay maintenance. Okay, so you're going to put in that if I pay maintenance, you're going to make sure I've got a new version of your software and I've got a seamless upgrade. Oh, well, no, we can't promise that. Well, you know what? Before we sign the contract, maybe you need to go talk to your folks and see if you can promise that. We as customers need to pressure the vendors before we give them our money when we've got some leverage, and kind of force them to acknowledge that this is the new reality and that they're going to have a plan for keeping up. And that's, I'm not in any way putting icing on that. I know how difficult that is, and I know it's going to be something you can't achieve 100% of the time. But right now we never even try. And until we start pushing, there's never going to be any give. And you're going to have to push for a while for there to be some give. This is a change the industry has to go through. But I think this is one of the big things. And then, Greg, you and I have both worked with automated evaluation tools in the past, and tools that can do what you were talking about, shimming. Sometimes not compatible doesn't actually mean not compatible, does it?
Right. Yeah, and that's sort of the things. It's nice to be able to talk about the idea of pushing back on the vendor, but in certain circumstances, the vendor is larger than you are, and so pushing is going to feel like pushing up against a very large brick wall. But in those circumstances, more often than not, it's honestly the smaller vendors that are the problem children. And for those, there are actually a variety of automated tools out there. They can actually take a look at an application, see how it behaves in certain environments. It can automatically install it in an old operating system, see where it works, see where it doesn't, and then provide you with a remediation report that will, okay, this app is going to work. This app is not going to work. This app requires a certain number of shims. And you and I have worked with a couple of those types of tools out there. They actually exist that you can put in your environment and point it towards a set of applications and go to town and tell me what the report is.
Yeah, and with virtualization, it's relatively straightforward to V2V or P2V a production machine, run one of these evaluation tools against the VM, let it do and a lot of times they can do automated remediation. They can shim the application to basically fix the compatibility problem and try it out. Stand it up in a lab environment, see if it works. I mean, the neat thing about virtualization is it's easy just to delete that VM and not worry about it because you didn't really affect your production environment. So I think the vendor doesn't support it shouldn't always be the answer. If the vendor doesn't support you moving up to an operating system that's still supported by Microsoft, then you really need to ask yourself why you care what any of the vendors say. I ran into this with a customer just last week. Well, we're sticking on Server 2003 because the application vendor won't support us on anything else. Well, yeah, but Microsoft won't support the entire operating system. So why does the vendor win that argument?
I was working with another vendor. This is a vendor of software that allows you to take virtual machines and make them physical, among other things. And that particular vendor was advertising as one of its benefits that when you do have to call your vendor and they do not support you in certain circumstances like virtualization or like on certain operating systems, use our tool to take a copy of your production system and put it in an environment that they will support so that they will help you fix it, and then go about fixing it in your actual real production environment.
Exactly.
These solutions actually exist.
Yeah, well, because that's the world we live in. And to move on and talk about this one a bit, this is definitely an area I have strong feelings on, lack of time and resources. I think the ultimate way to achieve more time is to look at everything you have ever done more than one time and start devoting some resources to automating those things. And I put the word private cloud up here even though I hate that phrase, because when you go to GoDaddy or Amazon Web Services or whatever and you buy something from them, you buy a VM or you buy a chunk of disk space or whatever else, they don't have a person running into a data center, plugging in a server, and putting your name on a P-Touch label. It all happens automatically. an automated process runs your credit card, it charges you, it runs some magical thing in the background that spins up the VM and allocates resources, and no human involvement at all. And that means they can run to massive, massive scale. Well, even if you're not running to that massive, massive scale, if you can get that type of automation, someone requests something, it gets approved, and instead of you setting it up manually, you click a button and it goes off and happens. You just freed up time, and that's how you make time, is through automation. And unfortunately, automation, like you said earlier, Greg, it requires an investment, and part of that investment is going to have to be learning how to do it. Because in the micro, at least, for a long time, we didn't have those tools. And it's really just in the past couple of years, I'm going to say, maybe since Windows Server 2012, that we started to really get those tools. But you got to learn how to use them, and then you actually have to commit to finding a topic and tackling it. And it's not just PowerShell. I mean, Greg, you do a lot of work with System Center, and that is another big piece of Microsoft's, again, I'll say it, private cloud. It's a big piece of their automation data center strategy, right?
It is their automation data center strategy if you look at the marketing glossies. Absolutely. There are equal reasons to get to know both technologies. And I say System Center is a technology even though it is a variety of different components. But when it was years ago, I mean, gosh, how many years ago? Almost 10 years ago, back in the SMS 2.0 days, when when you become a smart configuration manager person, when you just know how to, wield that tool with finesse, you can manage all by yourself 500, 600,000 different machines. And that was years ago. So these days, you can manage even possibly more than that. We used to think a long time ago about this notion of the ratio between the number of users a particular IT person can support. And I remember back during my earliest days when that ratio was like in the 25-to-1 or 50-to-1 like range. And it has in over the last 15 years or so, it has doubled and then doubled and doubled again. I was talking with a guy from Intel the other day who was admittedly promoting some of their vPro products, but was talking about Intel's goal of raising the ratio from the current like 500 desktops per IT Pro to somewhere closer to 1,000 desktops per IT Pro because of all the additional automations that they can lay now almost directly onto the hardware. So it's just amazing how with automation you can accomplish more. It's your force multiplier for getting the job done.
It is. And as you become more skilled, I think that offsets the last thing we were talking about, which is operational risk. Operational risk comes because you don't know all the facts. It comes because you can't react quickly. If you're able to automate things, and if you're skilled up on what's happening, and that's an important thing, if you are skilled up, moving versions along is not a big deal. You will be able to implement new versions of an opera when you need to and when you want to, if you are skilled up the whole time. So you've got to have those skills so that there are no unknowns. I was teaching a class a couple of weeks ago, and we were kind of getting ready to break for lunch, and I was asking some of my students, I said, how many of you are running very little to no Server 2012? And a few folks raised their hands. And I pointed at one of them and I said, can you tell me why? He said, well, we've got some software things we have to hash through. He said, but for the most part, we're just really concerned about the impact of Server 2012 on Active Directory. And I said, what? He said, well, there's all the schema changes it has to make, and there's this huge replication bit when you install it the first time. And I said, what are you talking about? And he had been bouncing around and put together some disparate facts from different blogs and things and come to this conclusion that just wasn't true. They had this fear of this unknown situation that didn't even exist. And so we talked about it for days like, well, I am clearly going to have to go back and do some reading up. And that's where the relevant training comes in. So you make sure you know what you're doing, obviously. Automate, because that reduces your effort and reduces the potential for error. And then you've also got to have training in how to make risk mitigation part of the routine. And I think there's one thing I want to say here, and I hope this doesn't upset too many people. It's going to probably upset a few, but this is the topic of mitigating risk when that risk comes from change is something that change management frameworks are all about. And I've had a number of run-ins with organizations that were based on ITIL. And Greg, I know you've worked in organizations with different frameworks and you've messed with ITIL. And,
Yes.
and it's really easy for organizations to get really skilled up and familiar with ITIL and to come away from that familiarity with the conclusion that change is bad and must be stopped. And that is not what those frameworks mean. Those frameworks say change has the potential to cause harm, and you simply need to manage that so that you know what the risks are and you mitigate them as much as you can, but that doesn't in any way, shape, or form mean that you stop moving forward. It's the IT industry. The point of us is that we're constantly moving forward, and yeah, we break things sometimes, but we're smart and we've got the right tools and we can fix them just as quickly. And I think that's kind of an important thing to take away too. But you know what? At the end, it's still easy for someone to sit back and say, you know what? I'm just going to ignore it. This doesn't have to happen to me. But it does mean, yeah, you're going to push some bugs into production. It means you're going to mitigate them, and that's okay, right?
Well, yeah, absolutely. If you know how to manage them appropriately.
Yeah, I mean, so long as you understand that I can fix this just as quickly as the problem comes up, because at the bottom of the day, the end of the day, this is happening. This is occurring. This is a thing that we are going to get new versions. You are going to be 6 versions behind in 6 years. It's just going to happen that fast. You can be frustrated. You can think, wow, I wish they wouldn't do this, and that's cool. There's some logic to that argument. But this is what Microsoft is doing, and you can't ignore it. Even if you choose to not do something about it, that's a choice. And I think there's definitely some action plan here. Let's talk about. Let's be positive. Let's have some sort of go forwards to start wrapping us up here. Number 1, learn to automate. That's if you are not at least learning to do some form of automation, whether it's System Center or PowerShell or whatever else is applicable to your environment. If you're not even, it doesn't matter if your boss is learning it or using it or not. I want to make sure that's real important. I don't care if your environment is gung-ho about PowerShell. I don't care if your boss sees the value of PowerShell or not. This is your career we're talking about now, and you need to be learning to do automation by whatever tools that are. So that's the first one I'll put out there. Greg, what's your biggest?
Of the tools to automate, you know me, I'll talk about System Center left, right, and sideways.
System Center all day, yeah.
Yeah, and it's important to recognize too that in certain circumstances PowerShell can work for you, and in certain circumstances there are tools that are built on top of PowerShell that can work better. They provide better visualizations. They offer they just make things a little simpler to actually visualize. But it's funny because you and I keep talking about this at the various stages and where you might accomplish certain tasks. You think of PowerShell as sort of the common universal bus that enables a Windows environment to interact with each other. And then tools that are built on top of that universal bus can become so much more powerful because it eliminates the need for complex, poorly designed agents to exist because they don't have to. It's all native and it's built right into PowerShell. You can use the solution of the command line for those really easy, quick things you need to pick up from time to time. You can then elevate into a tool, perhaps a System Center or some other tool that's out there for performing complex tasks. And then you can go in using both of those when you need to do very, very specific things that is something and no tool will ever provide for you. You need to, deploy a virtual machine with a very specific configuration that is something that VMM itself will not provide for. Well, you know what? You can combine the power of what VMM has with the power of what perhaps Configuration Manager has, an orchestrator, with PowerShell running everything underneath, or whatever the tool is. Or whatever the tool is.
That was a huge sales pitch. I'm sure Microsoft's super happy, but that is the place we play in, you and I. But the point is, be automating. And this is the other point, and I think this is something that a lot of folks might find a little unsettling about this whole conversation. Nothing will ever be done, and everything will always be changing. You will never hit the same type of milestones that you used to hit. You know, when Server 2000 came out and it introduced Active Directory, we all said, okay, this is new and I'm going to have to tackle it. I'm going to have to learn it because we're rolling it out. And then you got to a point where you said, yeah, I'm good. I know everything I need to get by day to day. And I think that's maybe, if we're being honest with ourselves, maybe part of where some of our current situation comes from is we just got really good at what we needed and we got a little complacent and we didn't push beyond that. But nothing is going to be finished now. There's always going to be another version. There's always going to be changes, and you've just got to keep up with that. And one way to do that is by keeping your skills up, right? I mean, Greg, you're constantly educating yourself, aren't you? That's part of what we do, is we have to keep up.
Yep, using every new project as an opportunity to pick up some new skill.
And don't let your environment drive whatever it is you learn. Just because your environment isn't moving forward does not mean you don't have to move forward. You can still learn, you can still be ready, you can still help the environment move along. You can find a new job maybe because you've got modern skills. I had a friend of mine, and this really was kind of an upsetting story, but if someone can take something from this, then good. I had a friend of mine who applied for a job, and it was at a new company, obviously, and it was using some really, really cutting-edge stuff. He was going to be doing a lot of work with Windows PowerShell and stuff he was very excited about. And he went and spoke with them, and they said, well, you know, we're pretty much on board, but we're a big SQL Server shop. Do you have anything with the latest version of SQL Server? And he said, well, no, we don't have SQL Server where I work. And they said, well, you're not going to be working here then, because that's a requirement. So make sure as you're training yourself up and you're thinking about things to look at, make sure you're looking at the broader industry, not just your office. And make sure you're finding training solutions and training resources that can help keep you relevant across the industry. Not an expert, but relevant. So that when an opportunity comes up, whether it's in your existing company or somewhere else, you've at least got the context to take advantage of it. Change is going to be constant, so there's no reason you shouldn't be just as constantly changing. And Greg, before we move on, I want to ask a question here. We have a question from the audience. This is one of the big things we talked about was automation. Have we found a good solution that creates a sort of self-service portal that users can log on to do common tasks like virus removal, software installs, those sort of things? And I know I'm much more of a server person. I'm not sure if you've run into anything out there like that for clients or not.
I want to use this as a pitch for that series I just put together for our sponsor Pluralsight on self-service automation and how the tools that exist to do that actually
you just finished that, didn't you?
I just finished it actually. I don't know if it's appropriate. Oh heck, why not? I just finished actually a series for Pluralsight on self-service automation using System Center. That one was on virtual machine automation, and there'll actually be another one coming out that's advanced self-service automation. But the tools exist in System Center. There are also other tools out there that can support that. So I don't want to seem like a focused only on System Center, but it's the one that I just very recently have had a lot of work in doing. But yeah, there are actually tools out there that you can literally have a user create a work order that automatically solves the problem that the work order intends to create and requests the approvals and accomplishes things through the connection of various different components. Yes, those tools absolutely exist today. The hardest part with them is that most of the content out in the world that will help you understand what the tools are, most of that instruction out there has to do with getting the tool set up. And I think the limitation then is that once you have the tool set up, it's actually figuring out how to use it, the arts instead of the science. And figuring out exactly how to use it is the part that, as I said, it's sort of more of an artistic aspect of using technology than the science. And that's the part that's the hard part, and that's also the part that can't be taught very well. So as you go looking around, I absolutely concur that there are tools out there that can do exactly what you're looking for.
And make sure that you are out there looking around. I mean, everybody who's watching this webinar today, you're doing the right thing. Take an hour of your time every single day and just learn about something random. For example, I was talking to some folks last week who they said, in our organization we have a fairly small IT team, but we're constantly spinning up things. A lot of virtual machines get spun up and down for different projects, dev projects, web projects, whatever else. And in our environment, we put some management on who's allowed to approve that, but once they have that approval and have the budget, they're allowed to do whatever they want within a framework. And he said, we're just having a tough time trying to build an interface that would let them do what they're allowed to do without having to call us every time. And I'm like, have you heard of Windows Azure Webpack? And he said, no. I said, well, it's basically part of the user interface that Microsoft uses for customers to do their stuff in Azure, and they give it away for free. And it's built on top of some System Center bits and some Windows Server bits, but you can basically run your own little miniature in-house Azure and have that same interface and everything else. They said, that would be perfect. Why have we not heard about this? I said, because you've not been going out and doing your half hour a day of just reading up on what's going on out there. Because there was a big kerfluffle about it when it first came out, but everybody now. So part of that training is to keep up and keep aware of what's out there, because change is the new constant. And the biggest thing to take away is don't be a bottleneck. I don't ever like walking into an organization and asking the question, so, why haven't you guys upgraded? And the answer is, well, our team really isn't up to that right now, or our team doesn't have the time, or our team doesn't have the skills, or we just don't have the confidence in our team. Man, don't let that be you, because that's one small step away from we're outsourcing our IT to someone we think can handle it better. And that means you lose your job. And I hate it I hate reading those stories, and I hate talking to people who've been through that. Don't be the bottleneck. Make sure that you're prepared. And in this specific little category, make sure you have the skills and the background and the confidence to say, yeah, if my company decides that the right thing to do is to upgrade, I'm ready. I know how to do it. I know how to do it quickly. I know how to do it as a routine thing, not a giant project. And I know how to mitigate risks as they come along. I've educated myself. I know what to do, and I've kept up to date. And hey, if your organization doesn't need you to do that for them, then maybe some other organization will, and that'll become an opportunity. But don't let you be the bottleneck. Don't ever let that become a risk. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Greg, any final comments?
Nope, not at all. Thank you all for spending some time with us today. Glad to have you, and hope to see you again.